Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karyne Messina and Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America, a special series on the New Books Network. I'm Dr. Karyne Messina, your host, along with our co-host, Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams. In this series, we discuss how the tools and concepts of psychoanalysis might help us understand the persistence of racism in America. We'll be talking to psychoanalysts and especially Black psychoanalysts about how to comprehend and combat racism. I hope you enjoy this series. Now, this is not a political podcast, but today we're going to talk about the 2024 campaign and presidential election. And the reason that we're going to do that is because we're going to also talk about both parties, but to not talk about something that's so important to every American, as well as people throughout the world, seems like that might be a form of conscious or unconscious denial. So we are going to talk about the election and the things that led up to it, maybe if that comes up. Okay, so we're going to ask each other questions and have a dialogue. So let me start. It will go back and forth between Trump and Harris, but I'm going to start out with Trump. Felecia, how did Trump supporters justify their continued support despite his legal troubles?
Oh, good question. Good question, Karyne. And before answering the question, I'd just like to share, it's just always a pleasure to have this time with you and to be able to share, and hope that our listeners will, take quite a bit of what we're going to share today and get to mind and spend time just opening up thought, because this is a very important topic as we begin to look at defenses as it's related to the election. And going back to your question, how did Trump supporters justify their continued support? My answer to that would be that many of those supporters likely used rationalization to justify their continued backing and focusing on the economic concerns and immigration issues. That was a big emphasis in the campaign, as it was brought up by that candidate and now president-elect. They may have also argued that, these policies really were prioritized and outweighed, and with many personal flaws or legal challenges as well. So there was quite a bit there just for us to really think about in regards to an important question that you raised.
Well, thank you. I liked your opening statement, and it was a very, very good answer. So I'm ready.
Well, let's think about something else too, Karyne. Let's think about, not only rationalization, but if we were to broaden that a little bit, I guess a question I would have for you would be, what about January 6th insurrection? How would we follow up with your question in thinking about the insurrection a year ago?
I've thought about that question so many times. And knowing how I feel about it, I always try to see if I can understand, or I try to do this as much as possible, and certainly when I'm aware of it. How does the other person who doesn't have the same thoughts and feelings I do, how are they seeing this? And I think that the best I've come up with in terms of a mechanism of defense is cognitive dissonance, where you believe one thing strongly and the other part of the argument you just kind of put aside. Donald Trump did such a good job of selling to the American public that something was done to him, that the election was stolen. And despite no evidence or very little evidence of that, but it's almost as if there was a protest and he/they had a right to protest. Now, do all the people who protested believe that? I don't think so, because I see people on TV say they thought they were just going to a rally of some sort. But nevertheless, it's the idea that you believe part of a story, but the other part you push aside. And unconsciously, it's not that you set out to do it. So that's one of my thoughts about it.
A very easy way to justify one's choice.
Yeah. What about other defense mechanisms that might explain the whole phenomena of the election, the 2024 election, Felecia?
Well, if we think of one major defense would be denial. Denial as a way to, kind of dismiss a lot of the reality that was so clearly in front of us. So I can imagine how that may have been a major part in how that played or contributed to some of the responses with the election.
I think that's a very good point. A lot of things at play here.
Yeah, as I mentioned, dismissing or just kind of like minimizing the significance, of as you talked about the insurrection, minimizing the impeachment, minimizing the criminal convictions, all of those things that were so alive during the campaign season and that was presented to the American public or, just globally, that with the denial, so much of that was put aside.
Yeah.
Now, if we were to expand on denial, one of the things that we know with this particular defense is that individuals do refuse to accept the reality when there's a conflict, and they defend against it, with their own belief or their desire, or when something is just too painful to hold. And so how much of that existed within the fabric of the election, whether it was, one candidate or the other, but I do believe that that was one of the major defenses was denial.
I agree. And you hit the nail on the head with when something's too painful. You don't really think about that, but it could well be the case. And we'll never know, but it's just too painful to think about January 6th. So if you just rationalize it, say it's something else, or just put it out of your mind, then it allows you to believe it, to think of other ways of looking at the situation.
And you're right, to put it out of our minds, but not only in making a choice when we went into the voting poll, but also how we began to experience it the day after. And so, how was it rationalized? What were some of the ways in which it was denied? So, there's so much aliveness to these defenses and being able to dismiss or defend against the pain.
Yeah, good point. Okay, I have a question for me.
I think I just might have a question for you. And just thinking about how might the Harris campaign focus on specific issues like abortion rights, rights for democracy, reflect a projection Karen, a projection of their own priorities onto the election. So I do wonder about that.
Yes, I think that you asked a very good question, and you gave me a big hint about because I think I think the Harris campaign really focused on the very important issues of democracy. I mean, who's not worried about that? And abortion rights. But I think they may have assumed that that was universally shared by everyone. It was important to all voters. And apparently, those weren't the most important things to all voters, or we would have had a different kind of outcome. So I think it was a projection of what maybe what we think is extremely important, but it didn't matter to a fair number of people in our country, or it didn't matter as much as it did to them, right? And to other people who believe those things are very important.
That's a really good point that you make. And I drifted to this place of denial again. Was there also some form of denial that, the American public, just really didn't want to hear anything else other than, women's rights and looking at democracy? But there were so many other powerful pieces to what we as the American people wanted to hear. And so, in that denial, could there have been more of a projection, as you just spoke of, that kept them from being able to think outside of what the American people really wanted to hear? And I know there was a lot of thinking about immigration. There was, as well as women's rights, as well as looking at the middle class American that really needed to have the support from the government, the American government. So there's many things there, and there were many focuses. But was it truly what the people wanted to hear or needed to hear, or was it more of the projection as in which you're speaking of as well?
Yes, I think we both agree on that. I wonder too if it's possible that Democratic voters potentially redirected their frustration with broader issues onto the Trump campaign as a symbolic target. I didn't think about that during the campaign, but I wonder about it now.
Mm. I think that deserves some thought right now. We could think about displacement, and we could think about how displacement may have occurred as Democratic voters just redirected their frustrations and economic challenges or societal changes onto Trump, and onto Trump as a symbolic target. And doing that rather than just really critically examining the incumbent administration's performance. So then something got left out that really would have been important to review and examine. But I wonder in that way. I do wonder in that way, because then what we know about displacement is that there are many emotions and reactions that can be transferred from one original source to a more acceptable target. So I think there was a lot of moving parts within one's mind during the campaign season. So displacement, I think, was definitely alive and well.
I think you're right on with that. Yes, so our focus on the mechanisms of defense continue.
Oh, yes. Definitely. Definitely. And we could definitely go into this place now. Got this question sitting in my mind right now, Karyne. How did voters on both sides consciously set aside negative aspects of their preferred candidates?
I've been thinking of that in different ways over the last few weeks. And
Oh, good, good, good. I wrote that down because I definitely wanted to hear what your thoughts were about that.
there may be other things, but I think suppression played a part. Was consciously postponing the attention to one part of the story. So this is actually, interestingly enough, more of a conscious process, but it's just like, I'll get to that part later. Something like that. And then focusing on the part that you really want to think about or the side you want to be on. So it's a conscious effort to avoid unpleasant thoughts or impulses. And what you focus on is what's first and foremost in your mind. Rather than this little thing that's in the back of your mind and say, well, wait a minute, what about this other part? That one you just kind of push aside. Make sense?
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
It definitely does. Yeah.
So here's another question. How did the persistent belief in the 2020 election fraud, despite lack of evidence, reflect a form of, and here's providing the answer, collective repression?
Oh, such an important question there. Um, and thinking about that, I would say, the just kind of that widespread belief among many of the Republicans that the 2020 election was just fraudulent. Just despite the evidence that was presented, and it could be interpreted now, Karen, as a form of collective repression.
Mhm.
But this is a defense. Collective repression is a defense mechanism that oftentimes we don't talk much about, but it does involve kind of that pushing or that threatening or that uncomfortable thought into the consciousness. And from doing that, allowing the individual to kind of maintain a sense of security and just in their own view, in their own worldview. So I think about it in that way. That's a defense that comes to mind for me is just that collective, repression, kind of as you brought that in from your question, how it might look.
Mhm.
Well, any other thoughts about that?
Well, I think you covered it pretty well. I think it's something that happens in political contexts all the time. Uh, and it's pretty central to group identity, I think. I think the key here is group identity, identifying with what everyone else is saying or what President-elect Trump said. I think people did identify with it because they were identifying more than just what he was saying at any one time. They were identifying with him, I think. There was a lot of identification as a defense, I think. Not necessarily, and I think people did that with Harris too, not sorting out the facts so much, but this is my candidate. I'm going with this person. I don't need to know the facts. No, did they say that to themselves? Maybe not, but I don't. I think that does happen. That people
I
just
think, yeah, and often see this in group dynamic. Whether we're thinking about it from, the election, but we do often see that in group dynamics where, a group just unconsciously pushes any type of threatening thoughts out of the awareness, and so it plays a big part. It brings in that threat of denial.
yeah. Thinking about our show, I was thinking about one of the things that I think confused a lot of people, and that is that Harris's stance on fracking. I think I watched an interview on that, and people were confused because She did, in 2019, she did express a strong belief that it should be banned. And then she seemed to shift her positions. Now, you can change. So there's such a thing as evolution in terms of one's thinking. You might have thought one thing at one time, and then when you gather more information or circumstances change, then you can have another belief. But I don't think that was clarified. It looked like she was flip-flopping a bit. And I think that caused trouble for people. And so that's another example of cognitive dissonance.
You're right.
So even for her supporters, I don't think a lot of people could have given a clear statement about where she stood because I think they were confused. And I don't know whether she was confused or not, but I think there was cognitive dissonance. The thing that you want to believe, you believe, and the other part that you're really not sure about kind of goes to the back of your mind.
That's right. That's right. Just kind of two contradictory beliefs, values, or ideas, and I think that really did make it quite difficult during the time of the campaign. And that held very strongly in how people chose to place their support. So you're putting your finger on, something else that's really important. Whether it was fracking or whether it was immigration, just trying to meet the needs of so many people that have been looking for some sense of relief or some sense of resolution, or even emotional healing. It did make it um, a hard moment for the candidate, for Harris, to be able to hold and bring forth very clearly.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have another thought, and I'd like to see how you're thinking about it or hear your thinking about it. It was the Trump campaign really honed in on it, and what I'm talking about is the economy or the state of the economy. I actually don't think the Democrats really capitalized on it, but let me see what you think about it. And the topic is, okay, so Trump and his people claim that the economy is so much worse than it is now. And then Trump also says he's going to put a very high, I've seen 60% as one quote, a very high tariff on everything that comes from another country. So if you look around, if anybody looks around their home and they think, now where does this item or that item come from? Whether it's a bed or a couch or a computer or a television, is it all made in America? Chances are the answer is no.
That's right.
If you have let's say 60% tariff on goods, whether it's something from Finland, China, or any place in between, I don't think those countries are just going to absorb that. I think they're going to pass it on to American consumers. This is what I don't think the Democrats said loudly and clearly enough. Something like in a different slogan that a person who comes up with slogans would say, but something like tariffs equal trouble, because as much as it's a nice idea to buy everything made in America, we don't have the infrastructure to do that. And it's going to take years. So I don't think that they really honed in on that after I thought about it.
And thinking about it, I rest with the cognitive dissonance.
Mm.
And the reason why I do that is because there was so much difficulty with bringing forth one's own beliefs and holding on to that with both parties. But when you're looking at one party as a way of resolving and bringing forth, or looking at one group and bringing forth something new, something fresh, something that will, ease the troubled mind, so to speak. You're looking at that group to be able to bring it in a way in which it doesn't bring any type of conflict. It doesn't bring any type of disturbance, but there's a clarity. There's a clarity about what you're thinking and what you believe, and that you could bring it without tension. And so oftentimes there was difficulty with the Harris campaign bringing that very clear, non-conflictual way of communicating. And so that seemed to be quite troubling to many of the American voters, and made it really hard, even though what they had to present was very important. But how it was communicated made it quite difficult. Now, with that being said, the belief of really preserving and holding democracy for the people, well, it was quite a lot. But
Yeah.
how did the people think of their own democracy?
That's the question.
That's the question there. And has the candidates really chose to voice their way of thinking of it? It really landed in the hands of the American people and how they chose to think of democracy for themselves. So, how they chose to clearly understand democracy for themselves, how they chose to have their own beliefs and values embraced and contained and protected. All of that came from within themselves, with how they also chose to place their vote. So that's where my thoughts go, Karyne, and with your question back to me on the Harris campaign.
Well, I think that's a very good answer. And I think this might be a good time to pause for today. And we could talk about this. I guess I always say we could talk about this for hours. This one we could talk about for weeks, days, months. And we probably will be talking about this for a long time, because the state of our democracy is a question for many people. Not for everyone. Some people think it will be just fine. Other people are quite worried. So we will be, as I said, talking about this, I think, for quite a while.
I agree with you. I agree that this is going to be years of discussion. But even more, what I believe we have been reviewing today is just group dynamics, and
Yeah.
how defenses become so relevant in how our view of the dynamics within the group actually exist. And so we have to keep that in mind, whether we're looking at this from a political standpoint, whether we're looking at this from a psychodynamic standpoint or psychoanalytic standpoint, um, organizational standpoint. This is something that is so important, as we talked about, rationalization, denial, cognitive dissonance. I mean, we tapped into so many different defenses that exist within a group. And so I think this is really important for us to keep, thinking about. And whether we focus in on it, we're going to end up coming back to it.
I think so too. And I think it's very important at this time of Thanksgiving, with the holidays coming up, that we think about our way of thinking about the election, and I mean, of course, we're going to have to wait and see about the outcome, but we do need to find a way to talk with our families or friends or people who are with us at our table. Politics in many situations are going to come up, and to say, well, we're not going to talk about politics. It may be okay for one meal, but generally speaking, we have to talk about politics. So we have to find ways to talk about it that don't split people and groups apart. And that's where mentalization comes in. It's listening to the other person in an atmosphere of respect. It's not agreement, but just being respectful of the other person's point of view without denigrating the other person or the other side's views.
That's right. And when one finds that it's really difficult to sit with that, to just take a break. You know, there's different ways in which we can find ourselves with family, with friends during the season where we are not going to necessarily agree, but if we could respect the other person, that they have their own thinking mind and their own view, and let that be known. You know, they're going to let it be known for sure, but for us to know that when is it too much for us and what is it that we need to do for self-care in those moments. And in those moments, you know, we can, you know, find a space that feels more comfortable for us and move into that space within ourselves and also within the space that we exist in. And sometimes we have to set very firm boundaries of what we will choose to discuss and not. And we may have to verbalize that with others as well. You know, what's healthy for us and what's healthy for me at this time in front of the turkey and family is to just really give thanks to just being together. So those are things that we have to keep in mind because this is going to be a season within our consulting rooms and also with family and friends that will be full of emotion. And emotions that may be connected to the election, but emotions that may be connected to losses and difficulties and aloneness. And, you know, just wondering about the fantasies we have of how a holiday season should be, but how it actually is in that moment. So I think we need to keep those things in mind as well.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. And I imagine some people will have a rule or guideline that they're not going to talk about politics. And that's probably the best way for that host or hostess to set up a structure that's best for the family or group. I think another way is to limit certain conversations, that we'll talk about one thing, but we're not going to open this up to a full debate or a full dialogue or argument. That if you want to voice your opinion, we can do that, but without going on too long about it. But the main thing is for each group to make a decision and to try to stick with that.
There you go.
Okay, well, we will continue and we'll be back next month, and we're going to start doing short clips, either weekly or bi-weekly in the very near future. So thank you, Felecia, and we'll talk
Thank you, Karyne.
soon. Okay, bye-bye.
All right.